Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to our panel on teacher assessment competence and accountability context. My name is Josh Lloyd, and I teach the assessment courses for the teacher education program here, and I am here to introduce this session. Our goal as researchers within the field is to share our work on teacher assessment and its goals in directly attributing to teacher preparation as well as teaching within the school. And we hope to do that today by sharing our work on teacher assessment. This is going to be done by three of our presenters. Our first is Jessica Beaver, who will be presenting on the teacher assessment system in the state of Washington and the thoughts that the teachers within the state have about it. Shortly followed by Dr. Chad Gotch and his discussion on the text or the Chad will get to it about test scores and their discussion within student-teacher conferences, parent-teacher conferences, a little bit higher. And then finally, we'll have Brian French discussing, gosh, my wording on this one's pretty bad too. The current assessments being used to measure assessment literacy. There's a lot of wording in assessment. Finally, our Dean, Dr. Mike Trevison, will be leading our discussion after a short talk. The main goal of this is to get teachers within the field or practitioners within the field into a discussion regarding teacher assessment so that we can better the work that we're doing. Without further ado, I will introduce Jessica Beaver, who will be our first presenter.
I'm going to stand over here, so the more important people you can hear me rather than see me. Is that okay? So as Josh said, I'm Jessica Beaver, and I will be doing a presentation on teachers' perceptions of the Washington State teacher evaluation system. Evaluation system, so quality and effective teaching requirements. We all know that there are policy changes that target low quality teachers, low student achievement, and teacher evaluations, and those being No Child Left Behind Act and the Race to the Top. The Race to the Top initiative gave around $5 billion to encourage states to implement evaluations to increase teacher effectiveness. The goal of these policies is to improve overall teacher performance and thus improving student achievement. And there are certain teacher requirements that these will, in particular, the No Child Left Behind Act has, and that's just for teachers to be certified in the state to teach, competent in the area they teach, and have a bachelor's degree. And again, ultimately, these goals of these policies is actually student outcomes, the development of student achievement, and increasing those through increasing teacher performance. So, teacher evaluation. So teacher evaluation is intended to indicate how well students and teachers are performing within the classroom. It is directly tied to funding, and teachers may be concerned with these evaluations because in part, some of their employment may depend on their evaluation scores. So teacher perspectives. Given that teachers have a lot to do with these evaluation systems and that they might be concerned with them, little is actually known about how the teachers feel about these evaluations. Little is known about the extent to which teachers agree with the system they're evaluated on, if they're involved in the system that they're evaluated on, if they're aware of their expectations, and how they feel about their self-efficacy to do these tasks that they're evaluated on. Again, evaluations are used to increase student achievement, and a good way to do this is the teacher's perspective is essential because the teachers know exactly what's happening inside the classrooms and they can explain the intricacies involved with student learning. Then there's teacher self-efficacy. So we know that when teachers are mentored, they have feedback, they have practice, they have training on these systems, their self-efficacy to do these training or these tasks actually increases. And so to know if teachers actually feel self-efficacious on this, that might mean they're performing higher in the classroom. If teachers are performing higher in the classroom, apparently there is a connection with that to increasing student achievement, which again is the goal of these policies. So Washington State has a new evaluation system that they implemented this year. They did a pilot year in 2012. The new evaluation system is based off of 8 criteria born from 3 frameworks. this provides a common language and vision for the school systems to have like what evaluations are. The pilot year data actually indicated that about 90% of teachers in the state of Washington agreed with the evaluation system that particularly the rubric that their district had chosen. However, only about 20% stated that they understood those frameworks that they were being evaluated on, and only about 16% further thought that those evaluation systems would hold teachers accountable for their actions in the classroom and student learning. So given those discrepancies, this study actually has these questions. So do teachers agree with teacher effectiveness criteria in which they are evaluated? How do teachers believe they perform the skills on which they are evaluated? So again, their teacher self-efficacy. And are there consistent agreement self-efficacy factors to evaluation frameworks? And finally, do teachers differ on efficacy and agreement with respect to certain characteristics of interest? And by those I mean, did they participate in training on the evaluation system, and did they participate in the pilot year? So the method for this study, 5,000 teachers across the state of Washington were surveyed for this study, and sample demographics closely matched that of elementary teachers in the state of Washington, within 4% in all those categories. The procedure we used the 3 email contact service strategy methodology, and that just means we sent out an initial letter or invitation to the study, explain what the study was, and provided a link right away for teachers to take. Just click on it and go. And then we did 2 follow-ups to that just to boost response rates. And as an incentive, we gave one of 12 $25 gift cards for participation. The instrument. So this instrument was developed verbatim from those 3 frameworks and the 8 criteria that are used in the state of Washington. Those frameworks including the Danielson, Marzano, and the Cell. The criteria, the 8 criteria include expectations, instruction, differentiation, content, knowledge, learning environment, assessment, families and communities, and professional practice. 53 agreement items were developed, as well as 53 parallel efficacy items. And what I mean by that is if I ask one question, do you agree that this is important to your overall teacher effectiveness? I also ask, do you feel that you can do this task well? Parallel, exact same question, just one's agreement, one's efficacy. So the agreement items were rated on a Likert scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. Those are the reliability estimates. This is capturing their agreement rather well. Self-efficacy items were rated from 1 to 7, not at all to very well. Analysis. I'm just going to kind of go through this rather quickly, but descriptive statistics. So those are used to obtain frequency counts across those individual items to see how much teachers are agreeing with them. There was a confirmatory factor analysis done just to examine the structure of the agreement scale, the self-efficacy scale. And as you can see here, those are the models that were tested. 1, 2, 3, 4 factors for agreement, and 1, 2, 4 for self-efficacy. And finally, those latent mean group differences were done, and that was again to see differences with teachers who participated in the pilot year, teachers who had training on the systems, and whether or not they agreed with the district selected framework from the beginning. So these results. So as you can see here, if you look at these percentages, actually teachers do, about half of teachers usually strongly agree. About 50 to 80% of teachers strongly agree with all of this content from those evaluation systems. And they actually, about 20 to 60% said they could do these things very well. It should be noted though that most responses did fall into the 2 highest categories for agreement, agree and strongly agree, and the last 3 for self-efficacy. So about very well, and a little bit in the middle. Self-efficacy. I did want to highlight this assessment criteria here. This assessment criteria is actually about using multiple student data elements to modify instruction and improve student learning. And that's what it states, and that's usually through formative and summative assessment. This does not address standardized testing, which is part of like the rest of this presentation. So I did want to highlight this piece about assessment. So it's not including standardized testing, nor is it including how teachers report that information, or if they do report that information to others. So this does not include that information. It's strictly on formative and summative assessment. So the confirmatory factor analysis yielded 4 factors for the agreement, and I'm just going to quickly go over those. So there's a general teaching factor in these, and you can see what they refer to over there. There's an instruction factor, a learning environment factor, and an expectations factor. The instruction, learning environment, and expectations are directly taken from those frameworks. They're the names of the criteria. those items were directly from those criteria, which is why they represented those factors. The rest of the items didn't really load on to any of those other criteria. It was just a general teaching. And self-efficacy, there was actually a one-factor model that estimated the data for teacher self-efficacy, meaning teachers didn't really see differences between levels of self-efficacy. They just thought it was general teaching self-efficacy. So there are some group differences here. And so teachers in the pilot year, or the pilot year and the training actually had higher levels of self-efficacy than teachers not in the pilot year or training. And these d-values are actually those practical significances. So those are actually very large differences between those. And although teachers actually had, teachers who agreed with the chosen framework may not actually feel self-efficacious even though they do agree with the system. And that's that final not agree group. And that's actually in accord with that 90% of teachers understand, but only 90% agree, but only 28% understand. Here, teachers who participate in the pilot year and had training actually had higher needs on that general teaching factor, instruction factor, and expectations factor, but they were lower on the learning environment factor, or had low difference on that factor, as you'll see in the next slide. And again, these are actually rather large effect sizes, so there are great differences between that pilot training group compared to teachers who didn't see that. And that might just be due to exposure. This is the same information on another slide, and that actually shows the no difference on that training group for the learning environment, but all relatively similar results. And finally, there are limitations to the study. The sample lacks variability. All the teachers generally answered or responded the same. High self-efficacy, high agreement. It's self-reported data, and we also did these group differences even though there was a presence of a lack in completely equal groups across those, which potentially confounds those differences. But the conclusions that I would like to take away is that teachers may not see that self-efficacy as separate components. As I was mentioning, there might not be like a math self-efficacy, it's just a general teaching self-efficacy. And then more importantly though, that exposure to these evaluation frameworks may lead to better agreement and self-efficacy. Meaning, let's talk about early exposure. What about teacher preparation programs and that early exposure we can get in those programs? A lot of the times teacher preparation programs really do concentrate on, say, the TPA rather than the TPEC, which is what I've been talking about. So you have young teachers coming in that don't have any exposure to this new system and don't know what they're going to be evaluated on. So if we can get early exposure, familiarity with these systems, that might increase agreement and again increase efficacy if they're familiar with this, and hopefully increase student achievement, which again is the main goal of these policies and so forth. So I'd also like to mention consideration should be given to teachers at a higher rate in research and policy processes, involving them, seeing what they think is important to teaching and what they should be evaluated on, and collaborating with these policy thinkers to make this mutual understanding of the daily tasks so the process can be smoother. Thank you.
And I'm interested in proper and effective use of assessments. So I do work around evaluating test quality, and I look at how student test performances are communicated. I look at how well understood assessment, testing, measurement concepts are for key stakeholders. And so what I'd like to talk with you about today is a study that I did that addresses the last two. It's at the intersection of communication and understanding. And it's a small study, but I think it provides a nice little window and some baseline information for us. I'm going to start us off with a quote. It's a bit long, I apologize for that. But I think it sets us up nicely. So it goes, currently there are many individuals, teachers and administrators, directly involved in assessment at local and state levels that lack formal training in measurement, statistics, or research design. I think that there will be a growing demand to educate these individuals. that is to make them measurement literate. I also feel that we need to do a much better job of working with teachers to help them effectively and efficiently use test results, to improve classroom instruction, and to make better prescriptive and diagnostic decisions. So this is coming from the president of NCV, which is the major professional organization for people involved in educational measurement. So if we look at these words, we see a call for the measurement community to reach out to teachers more so than it had been doing. And that's one that resonates with me. We also see a deficit model idea here in the words where teachers are lacking training, they're lacking understanding, the measurement community needs to come in and help. And it's probably based on some fairly safe assumptions in this area. But we really don't know a whole lot about what teachers know about assessment and measurement, or even what they need to know about assessment and measurement. And so the what do they know part will be addressed in the next presentation. I'm going to focus here on what do they need to know. So we have this call from the measurement community that's identifying teachers as in a position of authority and bestowing upon them a certain role and level of expertise that's expected. And then I said I also look at how student performance is communicated. So I spend time looking at test score reports. So here we have a student score report. This is from Washington. This is the sample one from the web, which is why it has all the little blue quote boxes there. And so we see scale scores, we see proficiency levels. And what's interesting, if we zero in on this, what do Elizabeth's scores mean? Toward the end of that, you see if you have a concern about Elizabeth's score or academic performance, please talk to her teacher or counselor to determine specific strengths or weaknesses. And as I've looked at these score reports across states, I've seen similar language. So in Hawaii, you see, for additional information, talk to Jane's teacher about this report, what it means, how you can help. In Massachusetts, if you have questions, meet with your child's teacher. It's not just in the US, in DC. If your child's results appear inconsistent, ask your classroom teacher for more information. Ontario, talk to your child's teacher about how these results compare to your child's daily classroom work. So we have this situation where the measurement community, through a leader of its organization, through the score reports that it's developing, we're identifying teachers as having a need to know something about these testing outputs. So I wanted to know, well, to what extent does that happen? To what extent are teachers called upon to step into this role? So I had two questions that drove this study. I want to know how often do teachers discuss student test scores in parent-teacher conferences? And then what factors influence this frequency? So I had a survey, a statewide survey, and I was able to get 186 teachers at the elementary level to respond. Across 94 districts, all 9 of our educational service districts in the state. So a pretty healthy sample. And so, just as a check, I wanted to make sure, is the parent-teacher conference something I should be asking about? Is that where I should be focusing my investigation? So I asked, how important is the parent-teacher conference in the overall relationship with parents? So parents do have that question, and they read the score report, and say, I should go talk to my child's teacher. Is it happening in the parent-teacher conference? And not surprisingly, yes, these things are important for the relationship with parents. So that's good, I can proceed. So then I asked, what level of interest do parents show in how well their child performs in standardized tests? And so we see it's generally a high level of interest. We're kind of centering on this moderately interested to very interested, some only slightly, some extremely. Not too many parents not at all interested. Okay. So I was curious, how does this compare with other things that they might be interested in? So what we've got here, the blue bars are the same as we just saw on the previous slide. I'm going to now add in some red bars to reflect some of the things they might be interested in. And I've highlighted the right two columns, so that'll just make it easier to see where the differences are. So how does that level of interest in test performance compare with level of interest in class projects? More apparent interest in class projects, at least reported by the teachers. about the same as how well they're doing in developing their emotions. A bit lower than interest in how the children are gaining skills to become independent. Less than interest in the attitude towards learning. And then less than their interest in how well students are getting along with others. Okay, so we see this fairly positive level of interest, not as high as some other things they might be interested in. So I asked teachers, how often do you discuss the student standardized test performance in the conference? And we have a plurality around frequently or always. So a good chunk of teachers are always doing this. They're not, sometimes often. About 11% said never or rarely, which was interesting to me. Because if you recall, we only had about 2% of teachers say that parents were not at all interested. So now I'm interested. What's going on here? We seem to have a gap in what the parents' level of interest is and whether teachers are talking about tests. So I want to talk about some teachers and learn about that. So looking at factors that might influence how often they talk about standardized test scores. Their confidence in interpreting the technical information seems to have a pretty high positive influence. So they feel pretty confident in their ability to do it. Beliefs in the value, not quite as high, but more positive than negative. Principles either doing nothing or it's positive. Other teachers, even more on that no influence level. Parents, going back to the parent interest, well, positive influence in discussing scores. So this is just a summary of those 5 that I showed you, kind of reoriented. And what struck me was the big swatches of white, no influence. Okay. So if it's not these things, what is the influence? Okay. And even where it's not white, we see a lot of pink and light blue, not a lot of really strong positive or negative influences on these factors. And this is after piloting it with some teachers that said, you identified the factors. So, next steps, I want to collect some data from other sites. So we've got Washington represented here. I'd like to go look outside the state where there's some different contexts perhaps. Build up the sample and reduce the margin of error on some of these estimates. Look at relationships between these variables. So how do these factors play out across districts with different demographic profiles, for example? District demographic information. Talk with the teachers. Sit down and talk. Help me understand these. What could happen? What can I gain? Share the findings with multiple audiences. Count yourself as one of them. And then I had the idea with this no influence thing. Maybe I was just asking about frequency. Yes, I do it, but maybe the answer is in the emphasis. So sure, I talk about test scores and then I move on to what's more important. All right. So maybe there's something there. And then ultimately, what I'm interested in is using this information to build the necessary supports so that we can have effective and proper use of the assessments.
Okay, that sounds okay? Great. So good morning. Thank you for allowing us to be here and talk to you about some of these important topics. I'll acknowledge my co-author, Chad Dodge, who is really a driving force in this research. My name is Brian French, and full disclosure, I am a user, I'm a builder, and I'm a researcher of educational tests and psychological tests. I've spent the last 15 years in my career studying educational tests, specifically looking at methods to identify item bias and test bias in tests, and studying differences across groups. So I want you to understand kind of my take on tests and where I'm coming from in that realm, because the work we're talking about today gets at some of those issues, not the bias issue, but basically looking at the technical properties of tests and making sure we have the right evidence around those tests to make conclusions about people and decisions about individuals and groups based on those scores. And so that's where this work is situated. So in this, what we're talking about, and what Chad alluded to, was a skill of assessment literacy. Assessment literacy has long been viewed as an important characteristic of effective teachers. Probably all recognize that. The teacher assessment competencies were heavily reviewed in 1987 with Schaefer and colleagues looking at this issue, and that directly preceded the publication of the standards for teacher competencies and educational assessment of their students. What we see when we look back at that is around 1991, Stiggins formally introduced the topic or the word of assessment literacy as populated in literature now. And our interest was on digging deeply into assessment literacy, what it is, how it's measured, and what's going on there. Jim Popham offers the definition up here that you can read. I can read to you. An individual's understanding of fundamental assessment concepts and procedures deemed likely to influence educational decisions. So if I'm a teacher, I'm thinking about what are those skills that go into assessment literacy that I need to be aware of and be confident in to be using data and making decisions about my class and my students. When you start looking at some of those skills, which some of you probably have, you see that they talk about what Chad talked about, communication with parents about those results. They might get at making instructional decisions in your classroom. And one of the key things that I think Jessica mentioned was really looking at using multiple high-quality assessments to collect information in your classroom to make those decisions. So when we think about that, we know, and there's good evidence, we think, based on what I'll show you maybe is not correct, that assessment literacy tends to be stable. So if you have that skill, it tends to stay there over time. But it is malleable, meaning we can change that. So it might degrade over time in your career, or we can enhance that through interventions or through training, which is a little bit what Chad was talking about. That construct has a direct connection to policy. Jessica talked about race to the top and the importance of what's going on there. When you look at that, there's a clear focus on teacher effectiveness. And in that, there's a clear focus on the evaluation frameworks that come with that. And within the Danielson framework, the Marzano framework, or the CEL framework from UW, Criteria 6 in the state of Washington focuses on that assessment component. That starts to get at all these qualities, maybe even limited in scope, about assessment literacy. And so that's what we're focusing our work is looking at that. The other context here I would offer is what Chad alluded to, that we saw from the president of NCME in 2009, about the call for educational measurement experts to really help out the field in terms of policy and understanding how scores should be used, how we should be looking at assessment, and so forth. And so that's part of our call is to do some of that work around assessment literacy tied to Criteria 6 in the state of Washington. So what we were interested in this study was looking at all the measures that are available and have been used to capture assessment literacy in the teacher population. And we were specifically interested in evaluating the technical properties of those measures and what exists out there. So can we look at those measures and make a decision based on evidence if we really should be using those scores to make decisions about teacher skills in assessment literacy? Does that make sense? So we looked at the years from 1991, so around when the term assessment literacy came out, through 2012, and looking for all the measures that would qualify under some type of criteria measuring assessment literacy in the teacher population. And so you'll see we found 36 different instruments, and they ranged in type. So there are 15 that were tests of knowledge, so think of what we heard about yesterday, kind of bubbling A, B, and C. Can you do this skill or not? What's a Z-score, and so forth. We found 14 self-reports of assessment competence, so getting more self-efficacy issues, are you confident in doing that teachers are self-reporting on. And then 7 rubrics for evaluating teachers' work, so looking at what they're doing and rating that based on a rubric like we did in classrooms a lot of times. So there were a good set of instruments out there. And in looking at that, we looked at 5 different areas to evaluate those. So up here I have 3 types of validity evidence we were looking at, or is the instrument capturing what we wanted to capture, and 2 types of reliability, or to think about stability of scores on those that we were interested in. And those included content validity. So if we look at the content, how people evaluate the content, and we look at that and say there's good content evidence that it's actually the items of assessment literacy. We looked at internal consistency reliability as well as score stability or test-retest reliability. And And then we looked at two forms of validity. One was the internal structure, or does the theory that the test was built on match the data? That's really what we're looking at with that. So Jeff mentioned factor analysis. We were looking for evidence based on that. And then most importantly, was how is this related? How is assessment literacy really related to student outcomes? Can we start to even make that link if that is an important characteristic to effective teaching? Okay. Now an example of the way we did this, for instance, for internal consistency, we would say our claim would be scores demonstrate enough consistency to support decisions about individual teachers. And we had, for each of these claims that we were making, evidence that we were looking to make that judgment. So in this case, we were looking for estimates of internal consistency. That would be above 0.95, which would be in line with standards in the field in terms of psychometric quality to make decisions about individual teachers. So we really set these claims up just as we teach our kids to do. You've got a question, make a claim, go see if you can get evidence to support that claim. So same thing we teach our kids to do, we were trying to do in terms of evaluating these measures. Okay. So here's the punchline. What do you see? Lots of zeros, right? Hopefully you see quickly there are lots of zeros. So looking across the three different categories, the knowledge assessments, the self-reports, and the rubrics, under content and under internal structure, zeros in every case. Meaning we could find no evidence in all of those measures that have been used in different research studies to evaluate teachers that there's evidence to support the content as well as the evidence to support the internal structure of those measures. If you look at internal consistency, it's a little better, right? There are a few, there's 2 1s and a 4, so that's good. If you know about internal consistency, you know that takes about 2 seconds to actually do on a computer and report that. So it's kind of surprising we don't have more evidence there since it's so easy, but nevertheless there is more there. If you look at test-retest, only one, or score stability, there's only one there under the rubrics. That means very low evidence. And most importantly, when we look at how assessment literacy is tied to student outcomes, there's just one there, right? So we're using these scores to try to make decisions about how effective teachers are maybe, but we really can't, we don't have evidence, at least yet, to tie that to student outcomes, which is important when you think about the teacher evaluation process. Again, this is just on assessment literacy or criteria 6, but I would wager to guess if you were to do this with all the other different criteria, you might see something similar. So conclusions we're drawing from this. Well, it's pretty clear with all those zeros there that our existing evidence around the quality of the measures we might try to use to evaluate assessment literacy with teachers is pretty weak, right? I would not like to see zeros there. And it's really it's unknown how ready we are to actually measure that skill in teachers. And that's just based on, again, one criteria in the whole evaluation framework that we're evaluating, or proposing to evaluate teachers on starting this year. So we're looking at really concerted efforts to start to document the quality and improve those measures that we're trying to use in this evaluation framework. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Can people hear me, or do you want me to put this thing on? Yeah, okay. I'll put it on. Okay, is this okay? Yeah, great. All right, thanks. So let's see, 15 minutes, right? I got 3 minutes of notes here. I appreciate being able to stand here before you. I could have done this a month ago, so how sweet it is. I had a knee injury, I'm almost done with it. So let me give you a little background of myself so you understand kind of where I'm coming from. First of all, in full disclosure, I have a degree in measurement from the University of Washington, and I completed that back in 1990. So that was my original education and training, was in measurement. Eventually, after I was in the private sector for a few years, and then came here, and then I had responsibility for the assessment course that was taught and continues to be taught here at of issue. I've been involved in various ways with the reform efforts in the state. I've met lots and lots of educators and teachers over the years throughout the state who have been involved with testing, assessment, whatever label you want to put on it, and we don't always use the same label, by the way, so this kind of confounds, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, this confounds our discussions around, in K-12 education in particular, assessment and its purposes. In addition, I haven't met, I don't think I've met any educator that doesn't have an opinion about assessment. So that further complicated. It's the same with administrators, and my own observations is we tend to be somewhat parochial about how we think about assessment. You know, if you're an administrator, you might have one view of assessment, and if you're a teacher, you likely have a different view on assessment. In addition, we have a variety of assessment strategies that could be used, and the really unfortunate thing, given rather sordid history of testing and assessment in K-12 education, is we often have these very strong views about what the right assessment is. Okay? And it often goes something like, one can never use a multiple choice question, one would always use a performance assessment or something more real world. And the irony there is we could set students up to not do well for the very same reason that we would if we continue to use multiple choice questions over and over again, which is basically what our statewide assessments are made up of. The sordid history of testing that we have in this country, I didn't get, when I was in graduate school, I didn't learn about how politicized testing was. I learned it as, well, it's a science. You know, it's psychometric, so I learned all about the measurement. But I do recall, I have these vivid memories of my major advisor, who was a nationally renowned measurement expert, who taught they call it a measurement course in the 1980s for teacher preparation, and he used his book. And his book is a very good measurement textbook. I would never want to use it for a classroom assessment course, but I can remember him coming, and there'd be a theater seating like this, and there would probably be 200 students in there, giving them hell, basically. And he would come back to his office, pop out his, aspirin bottle, take some aspirin, and that would kind of conclude his day. But for me, that embodies the mismatch between what we have historically taught in our teacher preparation programs, which was a course in measurement rather than a course in assessment that could be used to help students do better, to reach higher levels. So we have this, another confounding factor is all our reform efforts come from, really, if you wanted to pinpoint it, a document called A Nation at Risk. And if you've read David Bernletter's work and his colleagues, he pretty much unpacked and dismantled the data that was used to generate A Nation at Risk. But this thing is part of the, I'll call it mythology, that continues in the United States. And we lose sight of the fact that K-12 education, given its resources in particular, actually does pretty well for the majority of students, but that's lost in our discourse. I think the other thing to keep in mind from a legislative perspective is the answers to move forward are not all that clear. There simply aren't, and in the state of Washington, the biggest part of the budget is K-12 education. So from a legislative point of view, and people who are representatives are elected for 2 years. So they're in a real hurry to make an impact. So tests come into play. They're one of the cheapest things that can be used. So one can impose them fairly quickly, and one can stir up the pot with results as well. Jessica's, I also want to say that in the past, I mean, that's really rusty, but in the past I've done a little bit of scholarship with regard to assessment, particularly classroom assessment. I haven't done it in an awful long time, so I wanted to mention that. I also, you know, I'm a parent. My kids are adults now, but I can recall getting score reports home, as Chad mentioned, with go see your teacher if you didn't understand what was said. I happened to understand what was said on the thing. So the way I used it is, I used it as kind of an outside check with my students, with my kids' performance. And with my oldest daughter, who has done extremely well, and the mother of my grandchildren, she, you know, in her earlier years, through into high school, she would struggle in some courses, and she was the kind of kid at that time, I mean, you would never guess it today, but she was the kind of kid at that time that if you were to ask her to do 3 things, she would try to do 2.5 and see if she could get away with it. But so when I saw the low grades in various classes, I would look to her standardized test scores, and, you know, she'd be in the 90th percentile on all of those subjects she was doing poorly on. So I know they were multiple choice questions, but she couldn't have just guessed her way on an annual basis to the 90th percentile. So that's how I would use the standardized tests as a parent. And now that I have grandchildren, one just finished first grade, the other one just finished preschool, my daughter will send home assessments to me and ask me, what do I think about this? And so it just continues. Now, with the work that Jessica has done, and Jessica is one of our doctoral students in the educational psychology program, this work Education Research Association has a peer-reviewed journal, regional journal called the WIRA Journal, and so this work is in press in that journal. So I want to say congratulations to Jessica for that particular work. I did want to say a couple of things here, and that is, I'm wondering about just how representative the sample is, given 600 and something, and there were 5,000 teachers. So that's what, 14% or some give or take. I know the demographics. Lined up fairly well, but if we were to, and you mentioned variability in the sample, if we had 3 times as much, would they say the same thing? A question to consider. The other is that the methods used are very powerful methods. They're rather complicated, and for an audience like this, I know that was a challenge. So, but trying to unpack that and present it in a way that makes sense to try to reach a group like this will be, you'll have that challenge again, I can guarantee you. The other is this notion of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is an interesting one for me because it requires people as professionals to be reflective. And I think there's an awful lot of people who just don't get that. It's hard for them to be reflective at a core. And it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, you could be something else. So I think this is more of a national issue. So it doesn't surprise me, the lack of self-efficacy on the part of teachers. Let's see. Let me go to Chad's presentation. First, with Chad's presentation, I wanted to mention that again was wondering about the representativeness of the sample. I mean, it's just hard to get people. We're just kind of surveyed to death. It's just hard to get people to respond to these things, and we'd know so much more if we could get them. And if they do respond to them, are they just doing it for the heck of it? Are they really interested in it? What's their intent? And therefore, what's the veracity of the data you get? So that's always a problem. I very much appreciated the straightforward survey methodology that was used and the presentation. I mean, it's easy to get a hold of, particularly in a meeting like this. My own take on this is test scores are just such a small part of what teachers do. I mean, if you think about it, here's another thing, full disclosure. I was a high school math teacher. I taught at a Catholic high school, so it wasn't a public school. We had special ed kids in our school, so we weren't a college prep, much to the chagrin of some parents, but everybody had to pay for their tuition there. But I can clearly remember opening the door and, 30 teenagers come in and closing the door and just being there. And I did that 5 times a day, 5 days a week. And I know they took part in the statewide test. This was down in California. But that had just so little bearing for me as a teacher. And I would surmise that today, despite our emphasis with large-scale standardized tests, it's simply a small part of what teachers do. The stuff they do with regard to assessment is what they would consider more important. Now, that's just my own take, that's my own thesis, but I think there's some truth to that. In addition, tests are developed and imposed from the outside. They're not part of what teachers do, and as a consequence, I think they keep them at arm's length. That's at least in large part. And then last, with Brian's work here, let me mention, when it comes to measurement, there are broadly 2 kinds of measurement specialists. There's a large group of them that go into industry, to testing companies, and they build tests, they score tests, they analyze tests, they write proposals to state offices so they can, and so that they, through bidding processes, so that they can win these contracts and all that. So that's one group of measurement specialists. There's another group of measurement specialists, and I think Brian and Chad, Jessica probably fall into this group, and they use their measurement skills and the strategies and their intellect to hold the system accountable for accuracy and fairness. And so it doesn't surprise me in this case that the tests that are used for assessment to get at assessment literacy don't have the psychometric characteristics that we would typically want to see in tests that would be used for any kind of accountability, evaluative kind of purpose. So, in conclusion, I know Rick Stiggins. I haven't dealt with him in quite some time. He was actually had been a good colleague for many years. I'm impressed with people's ideas and the impact of their ideas. And if you wanted to pinpoint one individual that's had, I think, an enormous impact on K-12 education, and probably by extension higher education, it would be Rick Stiggins, because he was the one who really brought the idea of classroom assessment as being an important part of what teachers do, and that it ought to get a lot of attention and resources. So his work has gotten the attention of people. It's clearly part of policymakers' repertoire. The unfortunate thing is it doesn't get the resources that it typically needs, although we have spent a bunch of it in the state of Washington through the 1990s in particular. But it still doesn't get the resources and it doesn't get the emphasis that it needs. And the unfortunate thing is it gets woven into the fabric of our accountability systems rather than used to support teachers and teachers' work. The measures that Brian looked at, for example, I could see them with a mentor teacher working with a newer teacher, or an administrator working with a teacher, using it as a guide to talk about assessment practices in their own classroom, rather than using it as part of an evaluation system to hold teachers accountable. Again, that's my own take. Here's one other take I have, and that is, well, let me make them two of them. We have policymakers who are well-meaning for the most part, but haven't been in the classroom almost to a person, if I understand it right, usually. So they don't understand what the realities of classroom teaching are like. Everybody's been in a classroom, however. Okay? And so we have all of our own experiences that we bring to bear in what we do, particularly if it's related to K-12 education. And when we use assessments for purposes for which they weren't intended, and we use them sometimes for manipulative purposes, we get some rather negative reactions. I would surmise everybody has had the experience where you've been in an unruly classroom in a K-12 setting, let's say in elementary school, and the teacher says, all right, you know, folks, I'll use my own language. I'm assuming they wouldn't say, okay, everybody's screwing around, but you're not paying attention. Everybody, pull out a pencil and paper. We're going to have a quiz. Okay. So as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, we learn really early that assessments can be used for things that they weren't intended to, and they can be used for punishment. Well, those 8 and 9-year-olds are now 57 years old and are in the House and Senate in the state of Washington. And, I know that that's a leap there, but my hunch is there's some truth to it. That they're using measurement at a large scale for in some instances, punishment. So we've got an enormous amount of work to overcome in K-12 education, the role and place of measurement and assessment. Here's my last take, and that is, we're dominated by baby boomers, and I see something here. That they are the largest demographic group ever, the most influential, and we have some people on the right and the left, and very few in between. And my hunch is, when this generation retires and moves on, and the next generation fulfills policymaking roles, we might have a shot at a better picture with regard to assessment in K-12. So, anyway, thanks for listening. Oh, you want me to do that? Sure. Yeah. I'll hang around a little bit and ask, are there any questions people have for any of the presenters? Or me as a discussant, for that matter? Yes, Leslie.
I would like to know if Brian and Chad have had an opportunity to present the research that Brian presented to legislators. Have you gone and testified to any committees in Olympia and said, hey, look, what we found?
No, that dissemination has not happened. This is a work that will be coming out in educational measurement issues and practice very soon. But that will be another dissemination avenue to target, and that's a very good point. I think, going off what Dean Treverson was saying, in my mind, some of this gets at not only using tests in a punitive manner, but at the policy level, if you look at the standards for educational and psychological testing, if you look at NCME, our organization, you look at the standards for teachers' confidence in assessing students, all of those, and I use the term in the talk I gave, all of those talk about using multiple high-quality measures to make decisions about a person or a group. But what you see happen in policy many times is, and what was talked about yesterday in our keynote speaker, was we're focused on one score trying to make that decision to shut a school down. So I think what you're suggesting is very important to not only talk about the quality measures, but there actually needs to be multiple measures when we're making those high-stakes decisions about groups and individuals. I think that's, intertwining those things needs to actually be separated to educate really not what the industry and our governing bodies would actually advocate. But that seems to get lost somewhere between developing tests and then being put into systems.
Well, just as a reminder, we have a former faculty member who now has the governor's ear, Gene Sherrick.
Oh, right.
And all you have to do is use Gene's WSU email account and say, I have some information I think you should tell the governor about. And, I mean, we have that open
Yeah.
pipeline.
No, that's a great suggestion. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Jeff, I don't know if you want to follow up.
Okay, yeah, Rena, and then I'll go.
I have a couple of questions. One for Chad. Was it ever asked if it wasn't required that teachers report the test, standardized test scores for teachers to do it? Because a lot of teachers are required to do it without giving the opportunity or saying, yeah, I want to talk about this or I don't. So that might be an important question to ask. And then Jessica, was there ever any question about the conversation between the principal or the principal's knowledge about TPAP and reflection and self-efficacy? There's supposed to be, part of TPAP is supposed to be a grand conversation with the principal that may or may not happen, or may never have happened before TPAP was required. And then I don't want to But shouldn't part of wondering around a teacher's assessment literacy start with their knowledge of goals and targets? And is it Common Core? Because that, I think, sometimes we hear percentages thrown out by teachers in report card committee meetings, and they don't really have a question to percentage of class.
So, I mean, I think in Jessica's work, there was no question that got at what the principals were doing, so.
And the pilot information that I spoke about that 90% agree, the 20% understand, there is information in that report about principals. I specifically focused just my study on elementary teachers for now, but I am hoping to extend this into, like, say, secondary education teachers and principals, because they do have different evaluations. It's the same, supposedly, but different, and I want to see if they are different between those. And if you're using the same evaluation for different types of teachers, how that looks for principals. So I am working on that, but that pilot study did ask principals that kind of information.
But you're saying that there's a different evaluation system on grade level?
No.
Oh, what did you just say about high school different?
Just because they teach an elementary teacher teaches multiple subjects throughout the day, a high school teacher teaches different subjects, right? So I want to know if it is okay to use the same system.
So with the survey, I that was certainly in my head. I was actually expecting to see it play out more, where I highlighted that difference between the teachers that say they never or rarely talk about it. I was expecting that to maybe be reversed, right? And to see more negative influence on the beliefs and the values. I was sort of expecting to see, I think they're worthless. My parents ask about them, I have to do them. But that didn't come through as much. So that's it. It's interesting.
And I wonder if that would be really different between like K-5 and middle school.
Yeah, and it was focused on elementary level because of the parent-teacher conference aspect.
Okay, question?
I'd like to go back to Lynn's comment. In general, I would support going to the legislature, the governor, with information that we have that is good information. In the case of this particular study, I think that could backfire, because in essence what they might do is look at this and say, so what you're telling me is that the research that you're bringing to us is not good quality research, and it's providing them with mechanisms for not taking advantage of what we say. I'd be very careful about going forward with that at this point.
Oh, it's a good point. I mean, it's really hard for people in higher education to make a case with legislators. I mean, that's been historical in this state, and it's probably more so today because everything's so politicized. So I appreciate your caution. There's another question over here, so. No? Right here, yep.
First, I appreciate your work. I just came off a large funded research project on teacher professional learning and teacher advocacy in Alberta. And we found that just the history of Alberta is that we had a bunch of money. It's a resource-based economy. And when oil prices are high, Alberta is flush. And we use some of that money to create action research projects in every district in Alberta, where teachers had 3-year projects and spent a lot of time collaborating about what problems should we work on, how are we working over a 3-year period, and then writing results. We found a high degree of self-advocacy and we're just crunching it now. We've had a high degree of self-efficacy, and I think it's because we have a tradition in Alberta of collaboration between teachers. More than 80% of the teachers said that our best teacher professional learning is collaboration with colleagues. And perhaps that has something to do with the history of the province and the way that it's attended to school improvement. I do invite, and Chad, if you're looking for a partner, I'd love to see how Alberta teachers really do on the whole notion of just the research that you're doing. I'd love to partner with you in that research, and I think I can get funding for that within Alberta. And Brian, your work is very interesting because I think I would love to see how assessment literate teachers in Alberta are, particularly at the high school level, where the tests are. In fact, some of the tests become. I'm probably telling you too much that you don't care about. Some of the tests have become that sort of enemy, so that teachers and students can pull together in a team to defeat, as in a contest, what's happening there. So there's a lot of teaching to the test. There's a lot of and teachers are way more, I think, assessment literate. I'd love to see how that sort of plays out in an Alberta context. Just one question, Chad. I'm assuming because of the gender split that most of your 200 teachers or so were elementary.
They were all elementary.
All elementary.
Yeah.
There was that 80% women, or 86% women.
I think that might have been from Jess, because I didn't present, but yes, it's right. Yeah, so I did the demographics, grade distribution was pretty even, K through 5, and then some 6th grade, because in Washington, sometimes 6th grades in elementary, sometimes it's not. The sample was a little bit more experienced than statewide, but on those two, and then on gender is pretty good.
I'm also interested in that bunch that you pointed out, because it strikes me if you're a not very confident teacher, you might use another thing, like a test, to talk to your kids about. But perhaps the confident teachers rest in that. I know it's very important, but I'm way more experienced, and I'm confident in my own experience that this kind of flows into that experience, but it never sort of comes up in our conversation, but it's just sort of smooth. I may be way wrong about that.
Yeah, but the big driving force behind that study was trying to collect some data, because we have kids, we've been to parent-teacher conferences, we work with teachers, so there's lots of stories, lots of experience, but we don't have a lot of baseline information in this area to really know, at a broad level, kind of, it matches what we think, what we've experienced.
Good work.
Yeah, if I could just make a point to follow up on yours that's related, I think the importance of the assessment literacy as a construct was actually pretty clearly demonstrated yesterday in our keynote speaker when they talked about boycotting the math, and they talked about a teacher having some skills to say, wait, this isn't technically adequate. And so, kind of how what we were doing, looking at the technical adequacy of the test, if teachers and in collaboration with faculty can say, hey, wait, let's evaluate the adequacy of this, and gee, we don't want to use it because not only do we not like it, but look, we can show that through claims, it's not a good measure of what we're doing. That's a really powerful skill to have, and to me, that's part of being assessment literate. is being able to have those skills to make those decisions. And I thought yesterday was just a great example, not only boycotting it from how the students felt, but really a teacher being able to say, this is not technically adequate, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing in its unintended use. That was great. That's a great example of that skill.
I'm curious if that also plays in with development of curriculum. Because a lot of times when you're in a classroom, you get curriculum, not forced upon you, but you have to use it. And if you don't have the ability to evaluate the quality of the curriculum, you might have a very similar situation.
Yeah, great too.
I just have one additional comment as a venue for your collective presentations. Several of us in the college, like Sarah, doctoral student, Barry and I have been attending the Educational Opportunity Gap Oversight and Accountability Committee. And this is made up of some members in the House of Representatives, but mostly community stakeholders. They coordinated a speakers panel last fall here, and this is sort of the middle space of community representation because there is much dialogue around accountability, right? So to really present to this monthly meeting, they have mostly on the west side, it will be in Spokane, actually on June 17th, if anyone is interested in presenting it there. Very powerful about closing the opportunity gap in Washington State. And so it could be a very powerful presentation, or at the minimum sometime in the fall or in the year. Because I think together your strand is just something that really is not just formative for decision making in our state, but as a regional conference at NWATE, it's just timing. It's all going around, and clearly in our Canadian province members as well. So it's truly a Northwest dialogue, and I know nationwide, but I think I just really thank you for your presentation. It's very helpful to see your work. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a lot of thoughts swirling in my head. But Jessica, I enjoyed your presentation. It went quickly, so I'm not sure I got all the gist of it. But as a fairly long-term educator, and then being out of the system for a little while, another country for a little bit, coming back in, and then jumping into TPAP as it's being delivered right now, I saw the questions, and you can't. Well, I don't think too many teachers would disagree that all those categories, are marvelous, we're looking at that and becoming, going from basic to proficient to distinguished. And the efficacy, the idea is that it was presented to us that we should feel very good about this because we could then say, wow, we're proficient, or we are distinguished in this area. And that can feel very good, and hopefully many teachers would know some of that, but maybe not. So it could reveal that. But what I have experienced, I've been a comprehensive for 2 years because I'm new coming back into the system. So I'm right in this, and I just wondered, was there any addressing in that survey? I didn't see it, but the time and how much it informed your teaching. If it's just self-efficacy, or did it inform? Because I found, this year kept track, it was in excess of 30 hours collecting artifacts and things to show mostly where I would feel like I was at. So I spent a lot of time doing it, which my principal then had to review, probably a lot of time to go through. And I'm glad, maybe I'm glad to show the principal that I'm doing well, and I'm happy that the principal thinks I'm doing well, and I feel good that I'm doing well. But the thing is, I'm looking at only a very small portion informed my teaching. There's a little growth part in there, and I could look at that and say, okay, those students I'm tracking, to look at that growth, that informed me a little bit in there. A little, very small portion really informed, and to me was practical in my profession. So I don't know. In what you presented, I didn't see that as a part of that. Like, I would be the person to say, those are good things. Do you know what I mean? As an educator, who could disagree, really? All those categories of criteria, domains, all of that. It's supposed to be all there, right? But yet, and efficacy, yes, you hope you do feel good or feel empowered.
You can be able to do those tasks well. Yeah.
Yes. So I can see that, and I think I like your idea of looking early on. in the, you know, in the prep process too. I think that's a good point for starting out. But anyway, I'm just throwing out these thoughts, obviously, because this is going in a certain direction. But the dilution model for what we're trying to accomplish there, it's just something to keep looking at when we're self-assessing, when we're, you know, how can we do this in a way that...
Which is built into the model, right? The whole self-reflection, my teaching.
Yes.
It is in the system. I honestly, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure how you're going to be able to capture that, how well it's informing your teaching, but that is supposedly part of that evaluation system, supposedly built into that system. You know, there's one of those parts in there. I think it might be an expectations criteria. I'm not quite positive, but there is a component in that that's like, I am able to self-reflect. I think it's professional practice now that I completely remember. My professional practice, I am able to reflect on my teaching, and I do that well.
Right.
So
and that
there
would
might be some questions in there about informing, but in the actual language of this evaluation system, and I took all those items that I developed verbatim from this system off of the OSPI website. So took them down, wrote it all out exactly so that the language that I was presenting to teachers was the exact same as they're being presented from, you know, OSPI and state. And in doing so, there's nothing that really addresses how well it informs your teaching. It is very much so, can you reflect on your teaching well?
Exactly.
So,
which could result.
You know, exactly. And what I didn't present here, I did ask, you know, an open-ended question, because again, my questions were about your perspectives, right? It's not so much I can get necessarily from asking you, do you agree? Well, yeah, I agree it's an important teaching characteristic. I agree that it's something that I need to be doing in the classroom, and maybe it is practical and actually occurring in the classroom, which is part of this thing. I wanted to know if these evaluation tasks that you were being asked to be evaluated on are something that's actually occurring in the classroom. Is this relevant? Those types of questions. But in those open-ended questions, a lot of teachers did provide feedback. Like, this isn't really, yeah, I agree with it. I think these are great tasks, but I'm not sure how much that's either informing my teaching or there would be comments like, well, I'm a special education teacher. It's not quite the same. Or I'm a music teacher, I'm a PE teacher. I don't spend that amount of time. So there were differences there, which is why I do want to look at the system in a secondary level. Because, again, I found that one general teacher self-efficacy, right? It's just a general thing that you have for all these teaching characteristics, but it might be different for different types of teachers. But you're using the exact same system. That, you know, the criteria are the same, the components are the same, everything's the same from an elementary teacher to a secondary teacher. It's a little bit different for principals, but when you're doing that, you're saying those teaching skills might be the same throughout, and maybe they're not. And again, there's not that component of informing it, and we're using these to make decisions about people, about teachers. So it needs to be well aligned with actually what's occurring in the classroom, and I really think that that's what's that piece that's missing, that collaboration between those teachers and policy makers that are making these components and these evaluations. Because if they don't line up with things that are actually occurring, then how well is it really informing their teaching if it's not something that's happening?
Yes, thank you, Donna.
Yeah.
Right. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you for a great discussion.
Hey, I just want to take a minute before we go to a break and then our sessions since we have a screen, to orient everyone, if you haven't already seen it, to our NWATE site. It's a WordPress site, and so I know that I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and when you can become a member right here, it's very easy, but you will get a confirmation email that says WordPress, and a lot of times folks aren't making that connection and delete, and then you won't get updates and notifications. So if you do that, you'll be a part of our regular communications, and we would like you to know that we do have a journal. Jim Parsons spoke to that last night, and we really love to have submissions. We'll have a fall issue. It's an open space. As Jim said really well last night, we don't reject, but we do say, how about this, how about this, how about this, how about this, and we really work together to create a writing and sharing community from practitioner points of views to teacher prep to assessment eval. All of these voices are critical, and so since we're in the room and have that site, please take a second, just do nwate.com. You can get LinkedIn. We're really trying to build the organization organization, and it takes all of us. So with that, you have a 15-minute break. There's still coffee and refreshments out in Ed Ad, and then our next session is